Youth in this country have become yet another casualty of South Africa's economic malaise as the country recorded the highest unemployment rate in the fourth quarter of last year. That figure now is around 35.3%. Youth unemployment sits at about 66.5% when you look at some of the categories. But to discuss this further, we're joined by network organizer Lethiwe Nkosi from Youth Capital. That's a youth-led advocacy campaign for the reduction of youth unemployment. Lethiwe, a very good afternoon to you. Welcome to the program. You know, it's very hard to listen to the unemployment stats presentation without feeling as though we are losing the battle, isn't it?
I mean, it definitely points to the need for coordinated efforts in responding to youth unemployment. It definitely points to the fact that we cannot continue business as usual, because if we do, then there's no way of truly recovering from the situation that we find ourselves in as a country.
And I'm looking at the numbers here, 3.4 million, that's 32.8% of young people in the ages, between the ages of 15 and 24 were not in school, they were not working. And that, to my mind, then raises a more longer-term issue, because if they're not studying, then what are the prospects beyond that?
Absolutely. And just to add to that, one of the other challenges that we've heard from young people is that of the age bracket. So we know in South Africa, when you speak of young people, we're saying between the ages of 15 to 34. So now if you have a young person who has been unemployed for a long period of time and is itching towards coming out of that youth bracket, what are the chances of them being able to be employed unless something is done, unless, as I said earlier, there's a coordinated response to tackling youth unemployment?
And does that coordinated response appear to be clear to you? Does it exist?
No, it doesn't. So as Youth Capital, we recognize that there are different existing interventions that are not working in a very coherent way with an understanding of what young people need. So, for example, we have the Basic Education Employment Initiative, right? And that's a great intervention to give young people work experience in the education system. But now once that period comes to an end, once that opportunity has come to an end, what then should that young person do? And so there needs to be interventions that allow a young person to go from one opportunity to the next, really ensuring that they stay connected and they remain economically active. And
black women still are bearing the brunt of this country's unemployment crisis. 42.4% is the unemployment rate among black women in this country, and I'd imagine that is also reflected in the young people that you work with.
Absolutely. And so that's why I think not only do we need a coordinated approach in addressing youth unemployment, but we also need to listen to young people's lived experience as we create solutions to youth unemployment. When we look at the challenge that young women face, young black women face in terms of childcare, which then acts as a barrier in terms of them being able to apply for certain kinds of jobs, we need to then be mindful of what kind of opportunities we need to create for young black women, but also what kind of supports they need as young black women. But not only that, we need to also be mindful of the fact that young people are not a homogeneous group. So even when we talk about black young women, we talk about black young women from rural communities that have their own set of challenges in terms of entering the labor market. We're talking about young black women who may not have a matric certificate because of family responsibilities. So it is absolutely imperative that as we think about solutions for youth unemployment, we listen to young people's lived experience to really make sure that we respond to the challenges that they face and we support them enough for them to enter the labor market.
And even when we encourage young people, I mean, you and I were having this conversation right at the beginning of our chat about the fact that young people in this country are caught between two versions of hell, really, where you are either unable to study because you're poor in this country and have no access to finances, but also because you don't have, let's say, a tertiary qualification, it's also much harder for you to get into the workplace. 23.5% of graduates in this country are without work. So how do you even convince people to go ahead and study, because even then there really isn't a guarantee that you'll have a job to walk into after graduation day?
Absolutely. But I will say that, as much as a matric certificate, for example, is not a guaranteed access card to the labor market, when we look at the Quarter Labor Force Survey Quarter 4 report, we do recognize that there's a stark difference between young people who lost their jobs because they didn't have a matric certificate in comparison to those that did have. So there is a level of a safety net that a matric certificate provides a young person, and that's why we need to support young people to obtain their matric certificate. And if they didn't get it the first time around, we as Youth Capital strongly support young people to, go for the second chance matric program provided by the Department of Education. But not only that, just the last thing to say is that not only do graduates struggle with getting employment even though they have a certificate, but there's also an issue of experience, where I've heard young people tell me this, those that are part of our network, say that I have a qualification, but I'm asked to have many years experience before I can get the job. And we need to relook at that. We need to say, every experience of a young person matters. So even when you were volunteering, that should be recognized by prospective employers as valuable experience for you to enter the labor market.
And why is it not currently recognized, given that South Africa has a very specific socio-economic layout and circumstance?
I think there's a very narrow understanding of what skills can be acquired through different experiences, and I think work, and hence I want to return to the point about a coordinated approach. There are organizations that provide volunteering experience, and I think there needs to be, collaboration between civil society organizations that provide volunteering and the private sector in order to map what skills does a young person acquire when they're doing volunteer work, so that when they apply for work, they can signal to employers, and employers will recognize that because, civil society organizations and private sector are working together and making sure that volunteer experience still matters to an employer who's looking for a young person for an entry-level job.
What are your thoughts on the role of the private sector and how much it's done to try and bring down these worrying numbers?
I think the private sector has an incredible role to play in terms of, as I said, readjusting the experience exploitation and identifying the skills that a young person acquires when doing volunteer work. So, don't ask graduates for 3 years. Acknowledge that in their 4 years of studying, they gain certain skills, they volunteer, so recognize that. But I think also it's important that when private sector provides internships, that those internships really equip a young person to access future opportunities. We've heard as Youth Capital, young people talk about the revolving door where they hop from one opportunity to the next. And so I think it's the private sector's role to make sure that young people acquire the necessary transferable skills they need to access other opportunities.
And there's also been the ongoing conversation, Lethiwe, just as you mentioned, internships, about how some of the terms also need to be reviewed because they too are prohibitive, especially if you're young, black and poor in this country. For example, the requirement that a 21-year-old should have a driver's license as they seek an internship is a reality that does not exist for many young black people in this country because you often need to get your first paycheck in order to even take yourself to driving school.
And I mean, just to say, just drawing on that example, you have other responsibilities as a young person, family responsibilities that require you to support, because what we've seen is that many young people come from households where not a lot of people are working. So when you are a young person working in your family, chances are you bear the responsibility of also contributing to supporting your family. So you're absolutely correct. And that's why it is imperative. It is absolutely imperative for us as a society, decision makers, to listen to young people's lived experience, understand a young person's lived experience in order to make sure that they're supported not only to enter the labor market but to stay employed